I never expected that a routine notice from my building's management would change my life. But that's exactly what happened when the superintendent needed to test a spare key on my bedroom door. It sounds strange, I know. Let me take you back. My life, up until that point, had been a study in carefully managed solitude. My name is Miles, and I work as a freelance graphic designer from the quiet of my one-bedroom apartment. The space was my sanctuary, a curated world of muted colors, soft textures, and the persistent, low hum of my computer. My routine was my fortress. Wake at 7, French press coffee, work until lunch, a walk if the weather was nice, then back to the screen until the evening light softened against the brick building across the street. It was a good life, a stable life, but it was also a life lived behind a closed door. I was lonely, though I rarely admitted it even to myself. It was easier to call it independence. It was easier to pretend that the quiet ache I felt late at night was just contentment settling in. The truth was, I watched the world more than I participated in it. My window overlooked the building's small, shared courtyard, and from my perch on the third floor, I saw the lives of others unfold in brief, disconnected vignettes. I saw couples arguing and making up, friends gathering for weekend barbecues, the elderly woman from 1B tending to her resilient little garden. And I saw him, Caleb. He was the building superintendent, a job that seemed far too small for his presence. He was tall, with broad shoulders and an easy, capable way of moving that suggested a lifetime of physical work. He had dark, unruly hair that was always slightly messed up, and a concentration line that would form between his brows when he was fixing a leaky pipe or replacing a busted light fixture in the hallway. From my window, I watched him work. I learned the rhythm of his days, the way he'd wipe sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm, the surprising gentleness in his large hands as he helped old Mr. Henderson with his groceries. He was, in my mind, a completely different species. He was all tangible reality of the earth. He fixed things, he built things, he existed in the physical world. I, on the other hand, lived in a world of pixels and color palettes, of abstract concepts and digital files. He seemed so effortlessly masculine, so confident and grounded, that my brain immediately filed him under the category of unattainable. He was friendly enough, offering a quick morning or a nod when we passed in the lobby, but our interactions were fleeting, purely functional. He was the super, I was the tenant in 3G. That was the beginning and end of our story. Or so I thought. I had constructed an entire narrative around him without ever having a real conversation. He was probably married, or at least had a serious girlfriend. He likely spent his weekends watching sports with friends, drinking beer, living a life that was a universe away from my quiet evenings with a sketchbook and a curated playlist. This assumption was a form of self-protection, of course. A way to manage the quiet flutter of attraction I felt whenever he'd look up from his work and our eyes would accidentally meet across the courtyard. It was easier to believe he was impossible than to entertain the sliver of hope that he might not be. So, my crush remained a secret, a silent observation. I'd find excuses to go to the basement laundry room when I knew he was working on the boiler, just to catch a glimpse of him, focused and competent. I'd notice the small things, like the faded tattoo of what looked like a mountain range peeking out from under the sleeve of his t-shirt, or the way he'd talk to the stray cat that sometimes hung around the dumpsters, his voice low and gentle. These details only deepened the intrigue, making him more real and, paradoxically, even more unattainable in my mind. He wasn't just a handsome man. He was a kind one, and that was far more dangerous. The inciting incident, when it came, was not a dramatic burst of fate. It was a piece of paper, a simple notice slipped under my door. It was printed on standard office paper, announcing a mandatory, building-wide lock replacement for all apartment entry doors. It was a security upgrade, the notice explained. Management had hired a locksmith, but the final key distribution and system check would be handled by our superintendent, Caleb, to save on costs. He would be going door to door over the next week. I read the notice and felt a familiar knot of social anxiety tighten in my stomach. I hated interruptions to my routine, hated having people in my space. But underneath the anxiety was something else, a flicker of nervous excitement. This meant Caleb would have to come to my apartment. He would have to stand in my doorway, and we would have to have a conversation that lasted longer than 5 seconds. I taped the notice to my fridge and spent the better part of the day both dreading and anticipating it. A few days later, a handwritten addendum appeared under my door. It was on a small piece of notepaper, written in a functional, slightly messy script that I knew instinctively was Caleb's. It read, 3G lock change. I can do yours this Friday at 2 p.m. There's also a weird extra step for the original hardware. Need a minute inside. Let me know if that time doesn't work. Caleb, a weird extra step? My mind raced. What could that possibly mean? I was used to the vagaries of an old building, the sudden plumbing emergencies, and the finicky heating, but this was new. I felt a prickle of unease. Still, I pushed it down. He was the super. He knew what he was doing. I scribbled Friday at 2 is perfect. Thanks, Miles, on a sticky note, and left it on my door for him to find. Friday arrived with a slow, agonizing crawl. I cleaned my apartment twice, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean and arranging my books in a neater stacks, as if the state of my living room was a direct reflection of my character. I was a mess of contradictions. I wanted him to see my space, to get a glimpse of who I was beyond the tenant in 3G, but I was also terrified of his judgment. What if he thought my art prints were pretentious? What if he found my quiet, ordered life strange? At precisely 2 o'clock, there was a firm, solid knock on my door. It was the kind of knock that didn't need to be repeated. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my t-shirt for the 10th time, and opened the door. There he was. He seemed even bigger up close than he did from across a lobby. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt that stretched across his chest and a pair of worn jeans. He held a small toolbox in one hand and a set of new, gleaming keys in the other. "Hey, Miles," he said, and his voice was warmer, deeper than I'd expected. "Ready for the upgrade?" He offered a small, slightly tired smile, and I noticed for the first time the faint lines around his eyes. He looked like he'd had a long week. "Hi, Caleb." "Yeah, come on in," I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. I stepped back, holding the door open for him. He entered my apartment, and the space immediately felt smaller, charged with his presence. He brought with him the faint, clean scent of sawdust and metal, a smell so different from the paper and ink and coffee that usually filled my home. He got to work on the front door immediately, his movements efficient and precise. I hovered awkwardly in the small entryway, not sure what to do with myself. Should I offer him a drink? Should I retreat to my living room? Should I just stand there and watch? I felt like an intruder in my own home. You can relax, you know," he said without looking up from his work, a hint of amusement in his tone. "I'm not going to break anything." "Probably." I let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, good to know." I took a few steps back and leaned against the living room wall, trying to appear casual. "So, what's the weird extra step you mentioned in the note?" The question had been bugging me for days. He paused his work, turning the head of the screwdriver with slow, deliberate twists. "Right that. It's a little strange. So, the new master key for the building, the one I have, is a high-security model. Management's policy is that we have to make sure it absolutely does not work on any of the original interior locks. It's a privacy thing. So once I get this new one installed, I just have to pop the master in your bedroom door lock and make sure it doesn't turn. Takes 5 seconds. Just a weird liability check." It sounded plausible. It sounded just bureaucratic and strange enough to be true for a big property management company. But my bedroom? The idea of him, of this man I had watched from a distance for so long, standing in my most private space, felt intensely intimate. A nervous energy buzzed under my skin. "Oh, okay, that makes sense," I lied. It didn't really, but I wasn't about to argue. As he continued to work, a surprisingly comfortable silence fell between us. I found myself watching his hands. They were large and calloused, but they moved with an incredible dexterity and confidence. There was a story in those hands, a history of work and skill that I found myself mesmerized by. He finished with the front door lock and stood up, testing the new key. It slid in and turned with a satisfying, solid click. "All set there," he said, turning to face me. His eyes swept around my living room, and I felt my stomach do a little flip. He was looking. He was actually seeing my space. His gaze landed on a large print I had framed on the wall. It was an abstract piece, a swirl of deep blues and grays by an artist I admired. I'd saved for months to buy it. "That's a nice piece," he said, his voice quiet. "The color gradient is incredible. I was floored. I had expected him to ignore it, or maybe to find it weird. I never would have guessed he'd know what a color gradient was. You like art? I asked, my surprise evident in my voice. He gave a small, almost self-deprecating shrug. A little. I used to paint a long time ago. Nothing serious. He looked away from the painting and back at me, and his expression was open, a little vulnerable. It was the first time I felt like I was seeing a part of the real Caleb. The person who existed beyond the title of superintendent. It was a crack in the facade of the stoic, capable man I had invented in my head. Wow, I wouldn't have guessed, I admitted. Yeah, most people don't, he said with a wry smile. Being a super doesn't exactly scream artistic soul, does it? The gentle, self-deprecating humor put me at ease. I don't know, I said, feeling a new boldness. It takes a creative mind to figure out the plumbing in this old place. He actually laughed at that, a genuine, warm sound that filled my small apartment. You're not wrong about that. He held up the set of new keys. Here, these are yours. He stepped closer to hand them to me. As I reached out, my fingers brushed against his. It was a tiny, fleeting moment, but a jolt of electricity shot up my arm. His skin was warm and slightly rough. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned, my heart hammering in my chest. Did he feel that? Did he notice? I glanced at his face, but his expression was unreadable. Thanks, I mumbled, my voice suddenly thick. I fumbled with the keys, focusing on their metallic coolness in my sweaty palm. That brief touch, that accidental contact, felt more significant than any conversation we'd ever had. It was a small thing, but it changed the air in the room, charging it with a new, unspoken awareness. All right, he said, his voice a little quieter now. Let's do the weird part, and I'll get out of your hair. He gestured towards the short hallway that led to my bedroom. The shared laugh, the talk of art, the brush of our hands, it all culminated in this moment. He was about to cross a threshold, both literally and figuratively, and I had no idea what to expect. I led the way down the hall, my own apartment suddenly feeling like foreign territory. The space had always been mine alone, a place where I was completely, unequivocally myself. Having him walk behind me into my bedroom felt like I was willingly revealing a part of my soul that I normally kept hidden. The air grew thick with a tense, unspoken energy. My bedroom was simple: a bed, a nightstand, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the same courtyard. But it was also the most personal room in my home. The books stacked on my nightstand, the worn-out sweater thrown over a chair, the specific way I left my pillows, it all told a story about me. And now he was here, a quiet observer in the heart of my private world. He didn't look around much. His focus seemed to be entirely on the task at hand, which I was both grateful for and strangely disappointed by. He walked directly to the old wooden door and pulled the master key from his pocket. It looked different from the others, heavier, more serious. I stood a few feet away, by the dresser, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, a useless defense against the overwhelming feeling of vulnerability. The only sound in the room was the soft ticking of my alarm clock and the frantic thumping of my own heart. He slid the key into the old brass lock. The metal scraped softly. The sound was magnified in the silence, a harsh intrusion into the quiet of the room. He held his hand there for a moment, his knuckles almost brushing the dark wood of the door, and I could see the slight tension in his shoulders. He was just doing his job, I told myself. It's just a weird building policy. Then, he turned his head and looked at me. His eyes, which I realized now were a deep, hazel brown, met mine across the small space. He didn't smile. His expression was serious, searching. It felt as if he was asking a question without speaking a single word. In that instant, the pretense of the lock, the job, the building policy, it all melted away. This wasn't about a key in a door anymore. It was about something else entirely. His gaze was so direct, so intense, it felt like a physical touch. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. The world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, suspended in that silent, sunlit room. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection, so powerful it left me feeling completely exposed. He was seeing me, I realized. Not just miles from 3G, but me. And in his eyes, I saw a reflection of my own unspoken longing, my own quiet hope. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, he slowly turned the key. There was a faint, dull thud as the metal hit the internal mechanism of the lock. It didn't catch. It didn't turn. He gently tried again, confirming it wouldn't engage. The sound broke the spell. He pulled the key out and turned back to me fully. His face was still serious, but the intensity had softened into something gentler, more thoughtful. "Good," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't work." He paused, his eyes holding mine. "Your space is your space." He said it so simply, but the words landed in my chest with the weight of a profound declaration. He was acknowledging the intimacy of the moment, the boundary he had crossed. He was telling me that he understood what it meant for him to be standing there, in my room, and that he respected it. It was the most validating, most intimate thing anyone had ever said to me without actually saying anything at all. The professional barrier between us had not just been cracked, it had been completely vaporized. And in its place was a new, terrifying, and exhilarating awareness. He cleared his throat and slipped the key back into his pocket. "Well, that's everything," he said, his voice returning to a more normal, professional tone, but the echo of that shared moment still hung in the air between us. "You're all set." I just nodded, unable to form words. I followed him out of the bedroom and back to the front door in a daze. My mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had I projected my own feelings onto a simple, strange maintenance check? At the door, he paused with his hand on the knob. "If you have any issues with the new lock, just let me know," he said, looking at me one last time. "I will. Thank you, Caleb," I managed to say. "No problem, Miles." He gave me a small, almost hesitant smile, and then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and my apartment was quiet again. But it felt different. The air was still charged, humming with the memory of his presence, with the weight of that unspoken moment in my bedroom. I leaned my back against the closed door and slid down to the floor, my legs suddenly weak. My space was my space, but for the first time in a very long time, I found myself wishing it wasn't mine alone. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Everything had changed, and yet nothing had changed at all. The quiet routine of my life snapped back into place, but it felt different now, colored by the memory of that Friday afternoon. I replayed the scene in my bedroom over and over again, dissecting every detail until it was worn smooth in my mind. The look in his eyes, the tone of his voice when he said, "Your space is your space." The way the silence had felt so heavy and full of meaning. I became an expert in overthinking. One moment, I was convinced that I had seen something real in his eyes, a flicker of mutual interest, a shared understanding. The hope that bloomed in my chest was warm and dizzying. It made me want to run out into the hallway and wait for him, just to see if the look would be there again. But then, inevitably, the fear would creep in. The cold, rational part of my brain would take over, whispering that I had imagined it all. He was just doing a weird part of his job. He was probably just being polite, professional. Maybe he sensed my nervousness and was trying to put me at ease. The idea that I had completely misread the situation was mortifying. The thought of facing him again, knowing that I had built this entire fantasy in my head, made my stomach clench with anxiety. So, I started avoiding him. It was a cowardly move, I knew, but it felt like the only way to protect myself from potential humiliation. I started checking the peephole before leaving my apartment. If I saw him in the hallway, I'd wait until he was gone. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, where a chance encounter felt more likely. I stopped taking my afternoon walks through the courtyard, instead pacing the confines of my living room like a caged animal. My carefully curated sanctuary had become a prison. I was trapped by my own hope and my own fear. The worst part was seeing him from my window. He was still there, a constant presence in the courtyard, fixing a sprinkler head or patching a crack in the pavement. He was so real, so solid, and I was up here in my apartment, living entirely in my head, spinning out endless scenarios and possibilities. Our brief, easy greetings in the lobby were gone, replaced by a new, charged awkwardness. One afternoon, I was forced to grab my mail at the same time he was sorting through a delivery for the building. We were the only two people in the small, tiled lobby. I could feel his presence behind me as I fumbled with the key to my mailbox. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. "Hey, Miles," he said finally, his voice sounding cautious. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. "Oh, "Hi, Caleb," I said, trying to sound casual and failing miserably. He was leaning against the wall, a package tucked under his arm. He wasn't smiling. He was just looking at me with that same searching expression I remembered from my bedroom. "Everything okay with the lock?" he asked. It was a simple, logical question, but it felt loaded with subtext. Was he talking about the lock, or was he asking about us? About the strange new distance between us? "Yeah, it's great. Perfect. No issues," I said too quickly, my words tumbling over each other. I grabbed my mail, just junk mail and a bill, and clutched it to my chest like a shield. Well, I should. Get back to it. Work. You know. I practically fled. I didn't wait for his response. I hurried to the stairwell, my cheeks burning with shame. I had acted like a complete fool, a nervous wreck. I could feel his eyes on my back as I went. The interaction, or lack thereof, only made things worse. Now, he didn't just think I was weird. He probably thought I was actively avoiding him. Which, of course, I was. I spent the rest of the week miserable, angry with myself for my own cowardice. Why couldn't I just be normal? Why couldn't I have just smiled and made small talk? The hope that had been so bright after his visit was starting to dim, replaced by the dull, familiar ache of resignation. I had been right all along. He was unattainable. I had been given one small chance to connect with him, and I had blown it. The memory of that moment in my bedroom started to feel less like a promise and more like a cruel joke. I resolved to put it behind me, to go back to the way things were before. I would be polite, distant, and professional. I would crush the foolish, hopeful part of myself and lock it away. It was safer that way. The quiet loneliness of my old life was painful, but it was a familiar pain. The roller coaster of hope and fear was something else entirely, and I just wanted to get off the ride. A week after the awkward lobby encounter, I was working late on a project. It was nearly 10 at night, and the building was quiet. I decided to take a break and get some fresh air. I promised myself that if I saw him, I would be cool and casual. A simple, "Hey, how's it going?" That's all it would take. I opened my door and stepped into the empty, dimly lit hallway. I was just about to head for the stairs when I heard the elevator ding at the end of the hall. The door slid open, and there he was. Caleb. He was holding a bucket and some cleaning supplies. He must have been dealing with a late-night mess on one of the upper floors. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. My heart started pounding. This was it. He saw me, and for a second, I thought he might just nod and walk past, that we would let this awkward dance continue forever. But he didn't. He stopped. He put the bucket down on the floor and stood there, blocking the path to the stairwell. "Miles," he said, and his voice was firm, resolute. It wasn't a question. It was a summons. "We need to talk." My carefully constructed walls of avoidance crumbled in an instant. There was no escaping this. He was right. We didn't need to talk. The tension had become an unbearable, living thing between us, and it was time to either let it breathe or suffocate it for good. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I stood my ground, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. My mind was a blank slate of panic and anticipation. What was he going to say? Was he going to call me out for being so weird? Was he going to tell me to just act normal so he could do his job in peace? He walked towards me slowly, stopping a few feet away. The hallway lighting cast shadows across his face, making his expression hard to read, but I could see the seriousness in his eyes. "Look," he started, then stopped, running a hand through his already messy hair. He seemed nervous, which was so out of character it caught me completely off guard. "I feel like I made things weird the other day. In your apartment. And I'm sorry if I did." I was so stunned I could only shake my head. "No, it's not you. It's me. I've been weird. I'm sorry." "No, it was me," he insisted, taking a small step closer. "Here's the thing, Miles. The whole story about the master key and the internal locks. It wasn't exactly true." My blood ran cold. My breath hitched in my chest. "What do you mean?" He let out a long, slow breath, and the confession came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding it in for weeks. The building-wide lock change was real, but the part about testing the key on your bedroom door? I made that up. It was a stupid, clumsy excuse. I wanted a reason to talk to you for more than 10 seconds in the lobby. I wanted an excuse to be in your apartment, to see your space. To see you. The world tilted on its axis. Every fear, every doubt, every anxious spiral of thought I'd had for the past 2 weeks was wrong. I had not imagined it. It was real. It was more real than I could have ever allowed myself to hope. He kept talking, his voice earnest and laced with anxiety. I've been noticing you for months. In the courtyard, in the lobby. I think you're great. But I'm the super. There's a professional line, you know? I didn't want to be that creepy guy hitting on a tenant. So I came up with that ridiculous, convoluted plan with the key, thinking it would give me a few minutes to see if there was, I don't know, a vibe. And then when I was in your room, I totally panicked. I felt like I'd overstepped, and I think I just stared at you like a psycho, and then I've been kicking myself ever since. And you've been avoiding me, which I completely get, because I came off like a total weirdo. A laugh bubbled up out of my chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. It was all so absurd, so awkward, so wonderfully, beautifully human. He wasn't the impossibly confident, unattainable man from my imagination. He was just as nervous and unsure as I was. You're not a weirdo, I said, my voice finally steady. And I wasn't avoiding you because I thought you were creepy. I was avoiding you because I thought I had imagined everything. I was avoiding you because I have a massive crush on you. And I was terrified I had made a complete fool of myself by reading into something that wasn't there. The words hung in the air between us, raw and honest. Caleb stared at me, his eyes wide with surprise, and then a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face. It was a real smile this time, not the tired, polite one from my doorway. This one lit up his whole face, reaching his eyes and making them shine. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. You're kidding, he breathed, a look of disbelief on his face. No, I said, smiling back at him. Not even a little bit. He closed the remaining distance between us in a single step. He raised his hand, not to touch my face, but to gently brush his thumb over my cheekbone, a questioning, tentative gesture. So, that look, he started. I didn't imagine it. I finished for him. No, he whispered. You didn't. And then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a hesitant, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of pure relief, of weeks of unspoken tension and silent longing finally being set free. It was firm and sure, and it tasted faintly of coffee and overwhelming relief. I melted into it, my hands coming up to grip his shirt as if I needed to anchor myself to reality. This was real. This was happening. In the middle of the third-floor hallway, with a bucket of cleaning supplies on the floor, everything I had been too afraid to even hope for was coming true. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. So, he said, his voice husky, now that we've established that we're both idiots. I laughed, a real happy sound. Now what? He opened his eyes, and his gaze was warm and full of promise. Now, I was wondering if you'd be willing to let me back into your apartment. But this time, you don't have to stand awkwardly by the wall. And I promise, no more excuses involving keys. The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long, gray dream into a world of vibrant color. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for so long simply evaporated, replaced by the easy, comfortable presence of Caleb in my life. Our first real date was that very weekend. He took me to a small, unassuming restaurant he knew, a place I never would have found on my own. We talked for hours, really talked, filling in the gaps of the stories we had invented about each other. I learned that the tattoo on his arm was indeed a mountain range, a reminder of a hiking trip he'd taken with his father years ago. I learned that he had, in fact, gone to art school for a year before deciding it wasn't for him, but he never lost his appreciation for it. He loved the tangible satisfaction of fixing things, of seeing a direct result of his labor, something his brief foray into abstract painting had never given him. He was thoughtful and funny and possessed a deep, quiet kindness that I had only glimpsed from a distance. He, in turn, learned about me. I showed him my portfolio, explaining the stories behind my designs. He listened with a genuine interest that made me feel seen in a way I never had before. He didn't find my quiet life strange. He called it peaceful. He loved the way I had curated my apartment, saying it felt like a real home, a reflection of me. He confessed that from his vantage point in the courtyard, he'd often looked up at my window, wondering about the person who lived behind it. My apartment, my former fortress of solitude, became our shared space. It was no longer just my sanctuary, it was ours. It was the place we'd cooked dinner together, his casual competence in the kitchen a perfect foil to my by-the-book recipe following. It was where we'd curl up on the sofa and watch movies, his arm a warm, solid weight around my shoulders. The quiet of my home was no longer filled with loneliness, but with a comfortable, shared silence, punctuated by easy laughter and soft conversation. A few months after that fateful hallway confession, I was working at my desk when Caleb came in, carrying his toolbox. One of the shelves in my bookcase had been sagging under the weight of my art books, and he had insisted on reinforcing it properly. I leaned back in my chair, watching him work. He was completely focused, the familiar line of concentration etched between his brows. His movements were still as efficient and capable as they had been that first day he'd worked on my lock, but now there was a beautiful familiarity to it. He finished securing the bracket and turned to me, wiping a smudge of dust from his cheek with the back of his hand. He caught me watching him and smiled that slow, brilliant smile that still made my heart skip a beat. "What?" he asked, a teasing light in his eyes. "Nothing," I said, smiling back. "Just glad I have a superintendent who's so good with his hands." He laughed and walked over to my chair, leaning down to press a kiss to my forehead. "Well, I had to find some way to get your attention." He lingered there for a moment, his hand resting on my shoulder. The space between us was easy now, filled with a deep and abiding affection. It was a world away from the tense, charged silence of that first visit. It's funny how things work out, isn't it? I spent so long living behind a locked door, both literally and figuratively, convinced it was the only way to keep myself safe. I was so afraid of letting anyone in, of being seen and found wanting. But true connection doesn't happen in the safe spaces. It happens when you take a risk, when you allow someone to cross the threshold into your most private, vulnerable places. It turned out, the best thing I ever did was let a handsome stranger with a flimsy excuse test a key on my bedroom door. He didn't just check to see if the lock worked. He unlocked a part of me I didn't even know was waiting to be opened.